Wow. That was great. So welcome all to the last C21, no, the penultimate C21 event of the semester. 2 weeks from now, Tom Gunning will be up from Chicago to do a talk and a brown bag talk at 3:30 here, and then the brown bag seminar upstairs in the conference room at noon. Also, just let me remind you, after today's presentation, we've got a reception up in the conference room on the 9th floor as well, so please join us there. So it's really a pleasure to, serious, special pleasure to have the organizing committee of the MLA Subconference with us here to talk about labor issues really in the academy. This was suggested, the idea to bring them here was suggested over the summer, I guess, by Emily Clark, and it was a fantastic suggestion. So I really want to thank Emily for bringing this group here, and it just making it possible for not just for them to talk with us, but also for them to talk with each other, because this is a group of graduate students scattered across the eastern half of the country. Is that right? It's like, Occupy East, right? East and Midwest, right? This is an interesting time, and geographically it's an interesting time to think about that as well, since in California right now we're seeing occupations in Santa Cruz and in Berkeley against tuition hikes. The Board of Regents just passed tuition hikes of 5% a year over the next 5 years as a way to make up for declining state funding, and I think they're hoping it will be a way of sort of prompting the state legislature to call whatever to provide more funding. Seems like it's not going to work, but there must be some of it, and it's interesting to see how tuition hikes work differently in different places. Here at the University of Wisconsin system, tuition hikes have been outlawed by the state legislature, and so here you've got a situation where our conservative Republican state legislature is outlawing tuition hikes because we spend too much money on the universities, and the universities have been using their money poorly and things like that. Whereas, on the West Coast, we've got tuition hikes being opposed by left radical student groups. So different economies in different places bring different politics. Anyway, it's really nice to have people here. I wanted just briefly to, Reddy didn't expect to say what I said, so I will make this brief. I just want to say that, to say a little something about history. We're at a moment right now, and this group is really interested in history. They published a manifesto delightfully titled Theses on History, play on Benjamin's Thesis on History. And I think that we really are at a fairly distinctive historical moment, but this moment didn't emerge overnight. I was in graduate school from 1976 to 1983, and labor conditions for grad students were very different at that time. I was at Berkeley as a grad student, and we were allowed, grad students could be readers for course, that is grade papers for the first couple of years. And then you could be a teaching assistant where you would work with another graduate student as kind of a grader and a part-time teacher until you passed your qualifying exams. And only after you passed your qualifying exams could you actually be in the classroom, which meant for most people in their fourth year and sometimes even later than that, as opposed to now where students go right from being undergraduates to being teachers of undergraduates, sometimes within less than a month of their status change. I was hired by Wayne State as department chair in 2001, and a student I met who was just graduating in the summer and starting our graduate program in the fall was in the classroom really just weeks after commencement with no real, I mean, well, we had a 2-day orientation, you know, on how to teach. So there's been a real sort of evolution, I think, in labor conditions in that way. But in terms of the precarity of the market, that actually does have a longer history. When I was an undergraduate in the mid-70s, I was advised by my advisors, one of whom was Carrie Nelson, way back in the day, not to go to graduate school. There were no jobs and I shouldn't apply. And even back in the late 70s and early 80s, jobs were not more plentiful than now, but not super plentiful. I was on the job market for 3 years as a graduate student before getting a 3-year non-tenure track assistant professor job at the College of William and Mary. And I was on the job market all 3 of those years, and finally in my 3rd year there got a tenure track position. So it was 6 years of looking for jobs without getting a tenure track position. And there it was the position was at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, where we were a service department. There were no English majors. It was just, we taught 3 courses a quarter to engineering students as a sort of, well, literature was seen kind of as finishing school or something for engineers, moral inoculation or something like that. That changed. We actually did interesting things to change that at Tech. But there's been a crisis in that regard for quite some time. But I wasn't really aware of the labor crisis so directly. We had no grad students or no PhD students at Georgia Tech. But when I came to Wayne State in 2001, I was really shocked to discover that the teaching at Wayne State in the English department was divided about 1/3 full-time faculty, 1/3 graduate TAs, and 1/3 adjuncts. And at UWM, I guess it's even worse, right, Jason? It's like 40-40-20 or something. You know, and so there clearly has been a significant change in the sort of who's doing the teaching in universities that has, I think, produced a crisis, but it's been, as these guys have argued and we'll probably talk about today, it's a crisis that's been manufactured by state legislatures, by groups like ALEC and others, and even by administrators as well. So, you know, I've been a department administrator, you know, at Tech and at Wayne State before coming here, and I've tried to do in small ways what I can to help things, but, you know, and I think most of us have. And so this today is another small thing I think we're doing to at least try to help. Last thing I'll say, there's a bunch of theses, and I won't read them all, but thesis number 5 is my favorite, which is tenured faculty are not dodos, but they are often ostriches. And one of the things I really did find when I came to Wayne State and started to say to faculty, try to tell people, do you realize what the labor conditions are here? And, you know, it was amazing how people both had never really noticed on their own, and even after I told them, mostly wanted to put their heads back in the sand. Anyway, hopefully after today, fewer of us will want to. So I'm not going to introduce these guys individually. They can each introduce themselves or not, but we'll treat them as a collective. So take it away. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me okay? I don't know what distance this microphone should be. Is that good? Perfect.
Yes.
Great. Yes, first of all, we'd like to thank all of you for coming today, and we'd like to extend an enormous thank you to Richard Grusin, Emily Clark, Annette Hess, and to the Center for 21st Century Studies for both inviting us to speak and for wonderfully giving us a conference room for the past 2 days. As you heard, we're scattered around the country, so it's amazing to be here in one place. So thank you. The speech we're going to present today is part, or the way that we compose the speech is part of our ongoing experiment with co-writing, which has been an exciting and generative project, I think, for all of us. So the portions of the speech that we're each reading don't necessarily correspond to the sections we wrote. It was a very heteroglossic, collaborative initiative. Hopefully not too, not too messy despite that. And we'll try and keep it relatively short to leave some room for what I hope will be a productive discussion. Let's see. Oh, I'm a Luddite myself, but I've been instructed to inform you that you can follow us You can follow us on Twitter at MLA Subcon, and you can tweet about this talk using the hashtag communizing uni, if you feel so inclined. And finally, a number of graduate teaching assistants here informed us that they wanted to attend this talk today, but were unable to do so due to a mandatory end of semester meeting. And we just wanted to highlight, I think, that absence. It's a regret that you can't join us because it really speaks to a lot of the issues we're going to be discussing today. So, all that in terms of preliminary remarks. A major impetus behind the subconference was our desire to deconstruct the all too naturalized assumption that the only way to resist identification is through individualized responses such as increased professionalization, more and more varied publications, and accelerated time to degree. We decided instead to bring the rigorous ethical and political obligations cultivated in humanities research and scholarship to bear on our own subjective positions as workers, teachers, and mentors by promoting collective actions. But if such actions are to be successful, they will require, or so we will suggest today, that we take ourselves back to class composition 101. Composition is a term that most of us are primarily familiar with as the title of the courses that keep English departments alive today, and secondarily as the romantic aesthetic practice of putting things into their proper position, order, or relation, as the OED defines it. This aesthetic orderliness can be equally applied to the neutral and uncontested advice we get in the process of becoming professionals. Advice that tells us to remain in our places, to keep our heads down, and to accept the dictates that come down from administrators, legislators, and sought-after job creators. Our approach to composition today seeks to trace a thread through the past to the present, the dining hall to the classroom, in order to locate the tensions fomenting between the contradictory expansions and contractions of the university. This sense of composition, which comes from the language of militant research, co-research, and worker inquiry, seeks to understand how worker and student subjectivities develop in antagonism and difference to capitalist exploitation and its investments in technology, progress, and development. Or, as Gigi Ruggiero recently described it, the aim of co-research is the organization of struggles that understand subjectivity as a battleground which takes place between technical composition, based on capital's articulation and hierarchization of the workforce, and political composition, the process of the constitution of a class as an autonomous subject. Composition, then, is a non-neutral process of politicization that takes place in the university as much as it did and does in the factory, in a dynamic process that emerges between capitalist discipline and class antagonism. In our presentation today, we will discuss the various ways in which the process of class composition has been at work in the university, from its disciplinary form of the Cold War university to the neoliberal university, and finally to what we are calling with some ambivalence, the communizing university.
So part one, the Cold War university. The utopian vision of the Cold War university was an open access one, the desire to make a college education affordable or ideally free to groups previously denied one. Higher education in this vision became a tool for class mobility. The GI Bill, passed in 1944, was the most visible material manifestation of this vision. The act dramatically changed the composition of both mental and manual labor at the university. Whereas university education had for much of the United States history been reserved mostly for the children of professionals, the entrance of former veterans to the academy produced an explosion in admissions numbers and a change, at least superficially, to the class and labor dynamics at play in the academy. Many of these veterans had grown up working class and would otherwise not have been able to afford tuition. That this drastic educational shift occurred in relationship to the armed services, though, has a number of implications in regards to the value associated with higher education, the disciplinary models the university adopted, and the racial dynamics, primarily in regards to work of this new university. First, in terms of value, while the idea that a new kind of student was welcome in the academy did lead to the creation of a variety of financial aid services throughout the early years of the Cold War, it insisted that education was the product of a one-way market, where students were expected to give up something meaningful for the privilege of attending college classes. The one-way nature of this exchange extended and still extends to the classroom, where students are inoculated with information rather than taking part in crafting the pedagogical experience themselves. We can think about MOOCs as sort of the ultimate example of this. While this understanding of learning may have been true in prior versions of the academy, the Cold War boom in admissions calcified a particular understanding of labor. Students learn while faculty work. Yet the specific nature of this one-way exchange bears further comment. Veterans and service members were asked to risk their lives for the chance at a college education. To put this bluntly, education in this model asked students to put their bodies on the line for the possibility, always precarious, that they could emerge with a BA. Yet those students from families that had always possessed the means to attend college were exempted from this value transaction. While they too may have experienced education as a one-way exchange, they were not expected to treat it as valuable in the same way as their less privileged peers did, nor as precarious. We continue to see these ideological practices now in terms of rising student debt that cannot be discharged in the case of bankruptcy or even death. So here we see the boom in admissions, and then next. You can see in 1958, the National Defense of Education Act is the first act explicitly passed to bring low-income students into the university, and it's all about becoming a part of the armed services. Though scholars rarely describe it this way, the current student debt situation represents a new kind of biopolitics, where certain bodies are subjected to debt loads linked to their physical well-being. Andrew will elaborate on the habitual racialized terror to which certain students are subjected to on their college campuses. But for now, I will note that for working class students, higher education became something that one worked for, potentially in a dangerous industry, prior to arriving at the university. This division of labor casts work as a kind of penance, a legacy alive on our campuses in the immiseration of service workers who are themselves largely people of color and the outcasts of the system. As Ira Katz-Nelson and others have noted, despite the promise of a college education mandated by the GI Bill, veterans of color continue to experience de facto exclusion from college campuses even after the conclusion of their military term. Just as the armed services in World War II were technically integrated, but practically still segregated, with service members of color in integrated units almost always serving on the front lines rather than in more protected positions of authority, the opportunity for integration that the GI Bill in its most generous form represents was never realized. It is almost too obvious to point out that women remained outside of this system altogether, since nurses, telephone operators, and other kinds of military aides were not considered veterans for the purposes of the GI Bill. This means that the Cold War University reconfigured a class distinction, with working class peoples doing service work, while wealthier peoples occupied the professional spheres, into a racial and gender one, with women and people of color working service jobs and mostly white males teaching and taking classes. These racial and gender distinctions have persisted despite the adoption of affirmative action strategies and the end of formal segregation. And while the continued and accelerating lack of diversity among faculty, staff, students, and need we even say administrators, is an egregious injustice, the separation of service workers from the academic community speaks perhaps of even more nefarious set of exclusions. When we think of the university as a site of labor and include within that category the work students and faculty do, as well as the work performed by the people who serve and prepare food, janitorial staff, groundskeepers, and so on, an entirely different picture of the university emerges. Not only does this revised composition challenge the distinctions between intellectual and manual labor, it also calls attention to the parameters of the Cold War University and the way it continues to impact the present.
Okay, so I'll be talking about the neoliberal university. The form of capitalist political economy known as neoliberalism has structurally transformed higher education in North America, Europe, and Latin America to a certain extent. I'm thinking here primarily of Chile, Puerto Rico. There's also been obviously resistance. The central commitment of the neoliberal administrator, intellectual, or policymaker is to the framing of education in market terms. Marketization signifies the way administrators and some faculty valorize markets as their own utopia, a way of understanding and structuring the work of higher education, whether by, for example, invoking the long-standing platitude about knowledge production being a marketplace of ideas, institutional sectors as cost centers and profit centers, redescribing faculty as entrepreneurs and managerial employees, and borrowing from business the method of assessing performance through the analysis of measurable outcomes. In this framework, education is a commodity that its consumers purchase like any other, and whose price is allegedly set by the neutral mechanism of market efficiency. As the chairman of the University of Chicago Board of Trustees, Andrew Alper, as I'm sure many other chair people of boards of trustees say, memorably asserted a few years ago. The system of research created in the era of military Keynesianism, whereby research is funded by agencies of the state through competitive grants, is supplemented now by, had long been supplemented by partnerships with corporations, nonprofits, or foundations, as documented by Gary Rhodes and Sheila Slaughter in their book, Academic Capitalism. In addition, one finds entrepreneurially minded reformers, largely from outside of the academy, who aim to disrupt what they represent as a monopoly on knowledge of high-priced traditional universities, the supposedly staid, elitist, market-resistant groves of academe, with cheaper, purportedly more democratic modes of instruction, primarily online. Public universities have already become de facto privatized, as state funding has collapsed and reliance on private donors, student indebtedness, and financial speculation has correspondingly increased. As Andrew Cuomo recently stated, as did Milton Friedman before him, public education is a monopoly, in the view of neoliberals, that ought to be broken up by private actors, many of whom are nonetheless publicly funded, operating according to a market model. Higher education has been no stranger to the power of bosses to dictate everyone's working conditions. A central feature of neoliberalism has been the shift from a post-war compromise between capital and labor to attacks on the organized power of workers, as David Harvey and many others have pointed out. In the academy, we see the same workplace trends as in other economic sectors: casualization, outsourcing, denial of employee status, and union busting. In workplaces where not even collective bargaining can afford a degree of democracy, the administrative apparatus, including its police, rules with an effectively despotic, one might say feudal, degree of control. There are multiple constituencies to consider here. The students who, as Marc Bosquet observed in his classic How the University Works, are in many cases already workers. The faculty and grad students who teach them, the workers who maintain the infrastructure that enables teaching and research, and the administrators who maintain the dominant, though obviously not incontestable, position of power. The administration of higher education has adjusted itself to the demands made by women and people of color beginning in the 1960s for access to education and for a transformation of the curriculum to reflect the histories, cultural production, and perspectives of those historically excluded from higher education, whose slave labor constituted the basis of its institutional wealth in prior centuries, or whose domestic or secretarial labor helped to sustain a husband's research agenda. Official multiculturalism may offer a convenient branding opportunity for the development office, but in spite of affirmative action and occasionally more inclusive institutional policies, higher education remains a domain of white privilege, structural exclusion, and racialized terror, often from militarized police, campus police, as well as microaggression and outright hate speech from instructors or fellow students or employees. How do all these structural changes in higher education under neoliberalism manifest on a personal level for students? What forms of subjectivation are at work to encourage the reproduction of such a system, to maintain the consent of the governed? Investing in developing one's human capital, it turns out, can put one in a structurally vulnerable position. Neoliberalism's ideological mirage of the aspiring entrepreneurial self, a basic form of mystification in Louis Althusser's sense of an imaginary relation to one's real conditions of existence, puts all the burdens and risks of life on the individuated person. Here I could talk about how student debt does this, but in the interest of time, I'll note that scholars like Annie McClanahan have discussed, and Andrew Ross argues in his book Creditocracy, that making debt a condition of access to basic social goods like education, and for that matter, healthcare, is a form of extortion. And as Jeffrey Williams has pointed out, debt has a pedagogical effect. By binding the debtor to whatever job she or he is able to get, it teaches obedience to the dictates of the employer, consistent with a structural weakening in the collective power of working people. Students today who have been subjected to excessive standardized testing on the K-12 level have already long learned the virtues of obedience to authority and an automated process in which their subjective flourishing doesn't matter. In the neoliberal era, through the mechanisms of marketization, higher education plays a determinate role in capitalist social reproduction, producing inequality rather than lessening it, and reinforcing the already low so-called social mobility in the US relative to other capitalist democracies. Faculty and students looking to challenge this order often by default take their goal the restoration of the alleged golden age of the Cold War welfare state military Keynesian university in Ruth Wilson Gilmore's memorable account. But to make a sharp, well, left turn, what would a non-nostalgic, critical, even dissident and emancipatory education look like? What organizational forms would it take?
So Kareem and I are going to talk a little bit about this project for the communizing university. So this is the part where everyone's going to get a pony and a dog just while we go through this particular section. It's going to be the best part. Or fluffy kittens. So if the doors opened by the Cold War university were fitted out for subjects disciplined by militarization, and the neoliberal university created space for rational subjects compliant with the neutral market, then what we could call the University of Excellence of today represents itself quite romantically as post-disciplinary. To appeal to the student consumers created by neoliberalism, it schizophrenically offers certain innovations like limited open access, decentralized and autonomous study and research, and playground-style workspaces inspired by Google, Apple, 3M, and other tech leaders. So these are images of UW-Madison, which people probably know, the climbing wall, the revamped student union that was just built at an excessive cost after 3 votes failed and 7 years to fund it. And then the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. So these are all inspired, the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery specifically by Apple's kind of skunkworks approach. So instead of demands, the university issues options. Instead of working in advance to pay for the diploma of the future, students take out debt today in the risky venture of a future profession. The University of Excellence is self-fashioned in the image of the creative economy, which in the 1990s, quote, elevated knowledge to a central place in the economy and intensified the claims that the university would be central to future prosperity, end quote, as Chris Newfield describes. This university presents itself as open to all those subjects, flexible enough at least to withstand the fluctuations of tuition costs, lifelong re-education, and of course the paradox that very little knowledge produced by the knowledge economy emerges as profitable, which is to say privatized capital. Despite hopes shared by leftists and capitalists alike that material labor might be abolished by the knowledge economy, the concrete spaces consecrated for and by that economy suggest otherwise. For our purposes of trying to recover a truly communizing notion of the university, we want to look briefly at an exemplary sight of the contradictions of what has been represented as the communizing university of today, the dining hall. So this is probably going to be the first close reading of a dining hall that's ever taken place. Nothing like the pizza and jello operations of the past, today's dining hall reigns supreme among investments in reproduction on university campuses today. For instance, construction costs for the recently finished Gordon Dining Commons and Event Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison totaled $41,305,000. So that's $37 million in bonded funds and $3 million in cash, paid for entirely by students' room and board expenses. From the inside to the outside, from financing to services, it looks like every nickel and dime is a vacuum-sealed student affair for the students and by the students. Our version of the communizing university does not invest in that particular fantasy, but rather in the reminder that an antagonistic and alternative accumulation is happening alongside that of universities' debt cycles. To locate it, we only need to take one step further. It only takes one step, as Marx reminds us, into the spaces of the Gordon Dining Commons. about a minute shorter than the rest of the video goes
That's
on.
our theme song for this week, by the way.
And that video was made and put out a year before Gordon Dining Commons was actually made, just to add to the speculative bent of the university. But as you enter, you find yourself in the market, a pit-like space that puts you at the center of this commercial hallway. Lit by globe lights inside and out, the dining hall advertises a gathering of discreet opulence alongside the flashy hum of neon signs, signaling the kind of crowd such a venue is meant to produce, an image of an industrious middle class. All the while, the service workers are dressed uniformly so as to obfuscate their particularity and reinforce their anonymity and invisibility within a space in which they are both necessary and yet do not belong. Every aspect of this production, from the construction of the space to the actions of its participants, expresses how social relations should be enacted. Student and worker relations are kept to a minimum, while their interaction is reduced to a set of discrete and formal acts of exchange. The student is structurally enforced through the semantics of the social space to register that they are indeed in a middle-class area with the possibility, literally, of upward mobility to the maestro level. The division, so that was the next level, the second level of the building, and the Gordon Commons is called the maestro level. The division between material and immaterial labor is not an ideological projection, but a division enacted through material practices of spatial division, get food here, go read there. Yet, in a way, does the necessity to bring these specialized laborers, student, service worker, professional, for the university's social reproduction and the production of their indebtedness through habits of credit and predatory consumption, still provide contradictory potential to work against the logic of finance capitalism as it is expressed in the structure of Gordon Dining Hall's spatial dynamics. Recent and important work by Bob Meister, Brian Whitener, and Dan Nimser, Lee Claire LaBerge, and others has begun revealing the arms race style of campus construction and its reliance on tuition for what it actually is, an aggressive embrace of speculative capitalism on the part of universities. We see this on UW-Madison's campus as well, where the bonds for the construction of non-academic buildings specifically are paid off completely by tuition dollars. Academic buildings are bonded almost entirely by state revenue instead. And while the state contributed $478 million to our budget in 2013 through 14, this was almost matched in dollar amounts by tuition, but that amount of tuition is only $100 million greater than the proceeds of auxiliary operations that are generated entirely by profits from student housing, dining and food services, parking lots, and recreational sports. So this is just a little bit of a breakdown of UW-Madison's entire budget, and you'll notice that even though state and tuition is generally what people talk about, auxiliary operations is only 3% less than tuition, and that's comprised again of food service production, parking lots, and housing costs. So this latter source of profit is not inconsequential. Indeed, it means that revenues from reproductive services like room and board, food, rec sports, etc., is coming ever closer to the amounts of revenue generated by tuition dollars and state funding. So you can see a general trend at work here. Students pay increasingly higher fees, both for services and through backdoor tuition, and these funds are invested in projects that immediately reproduce bigger, better, and more expensive non-academic buildings to attract other students with the means to pay for future buildings. The money they spend on room and board is immediately invested in a building spree that requires for them to pay ever more for basics like food and housing, ensuring that every dollar spent on living reproduces the debt of the future that lives off of future students' lives.
While this focus on tuition and student disciplining is important, it remains too close to the financialized facade of the university without revealing where political antagonisms and struggle will come from. Our wager is that such struggles will come from workers rather than students of what Moten and Harney have called the undercommons, those whose material labor is included by the university, but whose race, ethnicity, class, and sexual positions must necessarily remain excluded. At UW-Madison, dining and food services are one of the largest employers on campus, reflecting the broader growth trends of the U.S. economy towards increasing feminization of labor and expansion in care and reproductive work. With the massive expansion in university and college populations, the services to provide for them have grown in both quantity and quality. So whereas the cafeteria at UW-Madison was once open at 3 discrete times of the day, the university now proudly offers cafeteria and market-based services from 7 a.m. to 1 a.m. But while resources are spent lavishly on the aesthetics of dining facilities, workers' wages stagnate. Classified employees at UW-Madison haven't seen a pay raise in 6 years. Hours are cut short, and job security is increasingly diminished by revamped HR systems. Over 600 of the non-student workers at UW-Madison make under the Madison City living wage of $12.62 an hour. Though it's worth noting that other living wage standards for Madison, one set by MIT and another by the National Coalition for Low-Income Housing, come in closer at either $17 or $19 range. Currently, low-wage workers on campus make anywhere from $8.80 to $15 an hour, and while the university has committed to raising those workers currently under the living wage to the city's living wage of $12.62 an hour, through a recent restructuring process, this wage gain comes at the cost of increased managerial powers to review and dismiss workers, alongside a shift towards individuated merit pay for further raises. Add to this the aggressive efforts by the university to free itself from the state, and we start to get a better sense of the contradictory movements of expansion and contraction in which the university is trending. Expanding service and space, contracting wages and work security. We said earlier that this dining space that serves as the exemplary face of the university cost an impressive sum of a little over $41 million. That's not totally true. Once the university finishes paying off the 30-year bond, including debt service and the actual principal, Gordon Commons will end up costing roughly $100 million, which will require bumping annual board rates up to $300 a semester for students. Thus, the university's technological investments, which range from video production to Wall Street-style speculation, necessitate that tuition, fee, and room and board revenues go towards ensuring a long-term ability to pay off debt service, rather than an equitable distribution of funds for workers who do not and cannot appear within the university's ideal virtualized self-representation. The point of attending to this shocking financial disparity is not to repeat something that we already know about the inequalities reproduced under capitalism, whether you take that point from Marx, Harvey, or Piketty. Rather, what we want to draw out here is the antagonistic capacity of the contradictions produced by the speculative aesthetics and technology, including technologies of representation and investment of the dining hall and the material labor and subjectivities that reproduce them. So whereas in the Cold War university, workers' struggle has often split along trade union lines, generally resulting in a notion of class or the subject of the working class as largely homogeneous, masculine, and heteronormative, that only ever rewarded the select few who enjoyed that subject position, the University of Excellence nonetheless solved the threat posed by this form of organization by removing the relatively fixed place of work for low-wage laborers through disparate and discrete shift work, temporary employment, and chronic underemployment, creating barriers of space and time for the homogeneity necessary for this form of organization. And yet, though this contemporary structure of precarity may seem to create organizational problems along the usual trade union lines, from the perspective of the communizing university, the apparent fracture of these traditional organizational unities destructures the division of labor so that the once historical and traditional separations between mental and manual, productive and reproductive, employed and unemployed are now more likely to be superimposed. In the case of the student, student worker, or the future unemployed, the very ambiguity of the identity category is itself a historical symptom of the quality of contemporary labor conditions, where the growing universalization of short-term contract work blurs the lines between lumpen and proletariat. And so a new problem emerges. If trade unionism is combated by capital through leveraging a growing reserve army of labor through the constant turnover of contracted labor, how do we corral the power relationship between employment and unemployment that is traditionally used against us? In our context, the university becomes a nodal space where custodial workers, administrative staff, tenured faculty professionals, and the future temp and unemployed coincide for an extended period of time, and thus provide a privileged space for organizing across trade union lines, given that we overcome the immensity of effort the university employs to ensure that these social and labor lines are not crossed. Another way to put this would be to say that we want to suggest that there is a communizing possibility opened up by the progress necessitated by the university within capitalism and the struggles over wages, worker self-management, and over racial, gender, ethnic, and linguistic differences that they enable. Or, as Anna Cruccio has written, we need to understand that, quote, the process of militant or political inquiry includes two different subjects, positioned at different points of the knowledge production process, practicing together a common production of knowledge based on its distribution and well beyond the distinction between the researchers and the workers. Such a process requires actively participating in the construction of picket lines and blockades taking part in assemblies and workers' meetings, as well as producing, together with workers, moments of close examination for activists and mainstream media.
So this is like the big dramatic break to the third section. I kind of want to cue the music again. So in this last section, we're going to further elaborate on some of the different ways of instantiating the communizing university. Great, the slide's up there. I am part of a movement at your university that organizes to improve both adjunct working conditions and your learning conditions. I welcome you to talk to me about how you can join this ongoing, growing movement. Imagine, if you're an instructor, beginning the first class of the semester with a statement such as this, and then continuing to detail the various types of labor and their relations at the university, whether in your classes at UW-Milwaukee or at the City University of New York, or I'm a PhD student in English and teach composition at CUNY's Medgar Evers College. Imagine further that you're a student in the class participating in such a lesson. What kind of composition or recomposition of the classroom and the university at large does such a lesson instantiate? And what are its implications? Framing the question in these ways echoes the tradition of, among many others, Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, Henry Giraud, and Peter McLaren, for whom critical or radical pedagogy begins by examining the lived experience of teachers and students in relation to the social, political, and economic structures that both. This is a typo. This is why, by the way, some of you might have, this is an insight into our collaborative process. I've been taking notes the whole time and recording people's ad-libs and also slight typos so that when we go back to revise this for publication, we have that much more information.
Reverse and transcend.
Yeah, but I check out transcend because I didn't like it. Yeah, because I don't think these things transcend the classroom, which is part of what we're going to talk about. We're coming to this conclusion. Yeah, this is also collaboration happening in real time. Yeah. The social, political, and economic structures that traverse our classrooms. Do you like the quite serene tone I'm using now, despite the messiness? Here, in this concluding section, we would like to recast this critical pedagogical tradition in relation to the workerist notion of class composition, a notion divided into two halves: technical and political composition, where the former entails the ways in which labor is structured by capital, and the latter the ways in which workers come to understand and struggle against such structures. These two aspects, technical and political, are already present within the very term composition, which is both a static or structural sense and an active or constitutive one. Statically, composition entails the makeup of the university and classroom in terms of, among others, class, race, gender, ability, nationality, and citizenship status, each understood as a social and political structure. Constitutively, composition would refer to the processes through which subjects develop critical awareness of these vectors of social and political power and begin to rework them, both discursively and practically, in order to compose ourselves as instructors, students, and workers into a new collective political entity. To speak of something like classroom composition, then, would entail an examination of the ways in which the university structures forms of work and divides them between students, faculty, adjuncts, graduate student workers, university food and service workers, and those who straddle the border between these categories. In beginning to grasp the nature of these forms of labor and their connection to broader capitalist relations of production and reproduction, but also, relatedly, to gendered, race, heterosexist, and neocolonial power structures, students, workers, and student workers begin to develop a critical political consciousness of these structures and can formulate steps to take against them. And here I'm going to self-consciously make an ad-lib and note how many times we repeated structures there. Something to work on. While educators who choose to bring a critical lens to the above phenomena are often accused of politicizing the classroom, the point is that, in this context, the classroom is always already political. In other words, the choice here is not between neutral and political perspectives, but between hegemonic and counter-hegemonic forms of politicization. Either education serves to legitimate the reigning economic, political, and social order, or it induces the interrogation and critique of that order with the aim of transforming it. Thus, critical, radical, and liberationist pedagogical practices take critique of structures and institutions, including the university, as their starting point, and center the issues, experiences, and perspectives of oppressed, marginalized, and minoritized communities, linking local context to larger scales. And an institution like the City University of New York, for instance, which reproduces the severe policing, securitization, and social and economic inequalities of New York City, an analysis of class composition means understanding students' lived experiences as they navigate the neoliberal city and tailoring courses and course readings to address those experiences. It also means teaching about the demands placed on students and instructors by the neoliberal university. These practices are certainly not without their risks, especially to graduate student teachers and contingent faculty overall, and to minoritized faculty as well, all of whom can and do face pushback and disciplining for daring to deviate from both the labor and ideological training of the neoliberal university on the one hand, and the putatively non-political objectives of the nostalgic university on the other. As such, it is imperative that established tenured faculty not only address these issues in their classrooms, but also that they support their much less secure colleagues, graduate student and postgraduate instructors alike, in their classroom interventions. We must be clear, however, that a critical pedagogy oriented towards transformative praxis cannot stop at the walls of the classroom, since, as we've already discussed in a little bit of detail, U.S. higher education continues to exclude far more potential students than it includes, by dint of a range of forces, from selective admissions and even open admissions, which are not, importantly, guaranteed admissions, to racialized social control in forms such as racially biased policing, immigration enforcement, mass incarceration, the school-to-prison pipeline, and public disinvestment at large. Further, the dispossession and genocide of indigenous communities and the concomitant enslavement of Africans and African Americans under British then U.S. settler colonialism, histories that are inseparable from the foundation of the U.S. university system, have not, outside of a few quarters, been seriously reckoned with in discussions about transforming higher ed, let alone society broadly. As Craig S. Wilder reminds in his recent study, Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's Universities, the founding, financing, and development of higher education in the colonies were thoroughly intertwined with the economic and social forces that transformed West and Central Africa through the slave trade and devastated indigenous nations in the Americas.
In order to genuinely communize the university, then, we would have to take seriously these histories and the related history of the enclosure of the commons at large, and further work to end these present legacies, which include the ongoing privatization of public higher ed and the reproduction of disciplinary and pedagogical practices that not only exclude oppressed communities, but also maintain structural exclusions in society at large. In this regard, recent work in indigenous studies, settler colonial studies, critical race and ethnic studies, and variants of critical university and education studies are helpful guides, as are struggles concerning academic labor specifically and labor generally in U.S. transnational and global contexts. In other words, what would the U.S. university look like after the repatriation of indigenous life and land, reparations for dispossession and enslavement, and commoning or communizing? One model are past and present freedom schools, specifically the Mississippi Freedom Schools of the 1964 Freedom Summer, and current incarnations such as the Chicago Freedom School and the Akwesasne Freedom School on Mohawk territory in upstate New York. And in a hemispheric conjunction, the Paulo Freire Freedom School in Tucson. Freedom schools are centered in liberation, focused on students whose lives and histories are minoritized in normative educational settings and linked to struggle, so that critical learning can then be used to affect broader social change. Another similar model is the Free University, created in New York City but starting to take form elsewhere, which occurs in public parks, community gardens, and other commons, so that people who are structurally shut out of higher education or who are deemed to be non-traditional students can gain access to and participate in critical knowledge production. Both Freedom Schools and the Free University are instantiations of communized educational space, which the communizing university might follow. Finally, such a project of transforming the university would also necessarily entail participating in wider struggles for social, political, and economic transformation, of which the academy is only one of many sites. In this way, class composition is ultimately a vanguard strategy for overturning capitalism by way of communizing current modes of neoliberal education and building a mass movement via labor coalitions that are composed in part in the classroom. Lest this prospect seem yet another hopelessly utopian gesture, and one at odds with our intervention here, let us stress that such revolutionary possibilities are already apparent. In Baltimore, for instance, where I finished my PhD at Johns Hopkins last year, I witnessed the struggle to confront the predatory capitalism of my university's redevelopment project in the city's Middle East neighborhood. In significant ways, the resistance to this land grab was framed by the militant research of scholar activist Maricela Gomez, who published Race, Class, Power, and Organizing in East Baltimore, a book that was then distributed for free by Red Emma's Bookstore Coffeehouse Collective to the people of East Baltimore, facilitating collaboration between various community organizations, radical activists, and scholars. At the same time, I taught a class on Latin American social movements that focused in part on land distribution, in which students participated in a collective land reclamation project at the Baltimore Free Farm, working with collective members to clear the land, harvest crops, and govern the farm. The students jokingly referred to it as the gulag, which I heartily approved of. The notion of collectivity in these examples is key, and a strategy that can be taken up in academia as well, via, for instance, academic Soviets or workers' cooperatives composed of excessed PhDs and faculty and staff who could facilitate autonomous universities and other forms of ad hoc transformative education. So what does this mean for you in the room today? What will you take away from our presentation? We invite you to recompose the academic spaces you inhabit, your classrooms, your departments, your universities, and to join us in the struggle to end capitalism.
Thank you.
One of you can call on people.
Yeah, please.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Hi. I just want to say first that that was really marvelous, and I want to commend you for the coherence of the collaborative work. Having done that myself a fair bit, I know what it's like. So I think you seem very, like, you all still like each other, which is it's true. It's not necessarily a given. So I feel like I have a million questions that I'd like to ask, but I'll try to keep it to two. Yeah, I think I can keep it to two. The first is just sort of about a little bit about the end of the presentation. I love my favorite moment. My favorite of the theses is the in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are different. But in terms of sort of the specificity of tactics, it seemed to me as if most of what you end on as the sort of last horizon still is in the domain of pedagogy. And I guess I would just be curious to know what other tactics you see as central to the project of communization. I'm thinking here about ways of what it means to transform university space in other than purely conceptual ways. So of course, because I come out of the UC system, I'm thinking about what's happening there right now, but also things like tuition strikes, student debt default movement, et cetera. So that's one question. The second question is that I take one of the central premises of communization theory to concern a sort of a structural account of crisis. And it's a structural account of crisis that would suggest that the desire to demand of the state that it return to the Keynesian model is not simply undesirable from the perspective of neoliberal capitalism, but actually impossible, right? Because the social surpluses that were available in that period of sort of highly productive industrial capitalism are no longer available, right? So that even if we elected representatives who really wanted to restore funding to the university, the funding simply wouldn't be there. So again, thinking about California and the fact, right, that like in the end it comes down to the impossibility of paying those pension plans. So I guess I'd like to hear you all say a little bit about, and the reason I ask that is because I have been in rooms like this many times where the sort of politics at the end is like, go talk to your legislator. And God knows at Berkeley it was always like, why are you doing this? Why are you bitching at the administration? Why aren't you talking to your legislator? What I like about work like y'all's is that it's not about that, and I think that that's appropriate, and I think we need more of it. And so I'd just like to hear you say a little bit about what you say to people who say, you know, go elect more Democrats, all that garbage. Yeah.
Maybe. Those are two great questions, and I imagine we're all going to want to, or maybe all of us are going to want to say something about both of them. So I'm going to not try and address them both comprehensively, but just put in little pieces that I think people will pick up on. One part of which is we absolutely don't mean to suggest, I think, that, you know, this stops at a kind of pedagogical practice. Although I do think that pedagogy can be something that we expand and think about in all kinds of different work that we're doing. But I think all of us are really oriented towards transformative practice and trying to see what that would look like. At the same time, personally, and then other people are going to talk about a whole bunch of other aspects of it. So I want to talk briefly about the idea of co-research or militant research that we've mentioned a couple of times, because I often feel like for academics of a radical or activist bent, there is this reified opposition, right, between theory and praxis, and there's this notion of like either we're up in the ivory tower doing our intellectual work, or we're out in the streets. And I think that co-research is one way of really bridging that divide, of saying like, what tools and resources do I have access to that can be actually put directly into use for community struggles, which can be really challenging work. So I can talk in more detail about what attempts to do that look like, but that to me is one place to try and think strategically about bridging that gap in one specific way. And then I have lots of things to say about communization theory. I'm going to try and keep it short, but we can talk later. One brief point is we struggled a lot when we were thinking about our kind of notion of what university model, what utopia we're proposing. We talked about commoning, we proposed a couple of different words, and they all are kind of already associated with kind of very specific thinkers or figures. So we ran with communizing. I don't know that we want to necessarily limit ourselves to the notion of communization theory in working with that concept, although I personally have been very, have read and have been thinking through, the notes of open to people quite a bit. But I think the million-dollar question you ask is, what does it mean to be trying to move towards, forget even a revolutionary horizon, but also move towards even winning limited reforms in a period where it becomes increasingly difficult to win those reforms. So that's a million-dollar question that I'd love to come back to, and I'm going to let other people talk in the meantime.
Well, I think in terms of your first question, Kareem should definitely talk about what kinds of other things we can do outside of pedagogy, which you should talk about really quickly.
Well, wage collectivization is an option. That's kind of straightforward. And surprisingly, once you get over the initial ideological hurdle of, oh my God, what do you mean share my wages with like someone that's like in my department who I'm not close with or something like that. Then actually the next problem, which is more difficult, is the collectivization of labor. Because wage collectivization is relatively simple in terms of discounting some of the hurdles that are posed by the bureaucracy in terms of trying to individuate you along grant lines and economic lines. Wage collectivization becomes an easy way to solve that. But then one of the forms of material practice in which individuation is still occurs despite the collectivization of wages is labor, very, very obviously. And that becomes more difficult precisely because then you're not just talking about, say, opening up a bank account and everyone in your department putting money in it. Now you're talking about actual physical spaces. Like you're contracted to teach this class. You can't just replace yourself with someone else. Sometimes there are people watching, sometimes they're not. So you can get away with it, but sometimes you can't. The students have certain expectations that you're the instructor. It's on paper. And also in terms of just the spatial construction of the classroom. Sometimes you're in different buildings, so it's hard. I mean, so there are, I think those are the problems in terms of it's not purely pedagogical, but a form of inaugurating social relations that actually tries to combat the everyday lived practices in which capitalism creates you as competitive subjects with one another. And I think it's a form of social practice, but it's difficult. You have to do the work to establish solidarity across lines that aren't initially there, and the problems that are posed are both difficult to overcome and interesting, because you're not just talking about collectivizing your wages and labor practices with people in your department, because that sometimes is relatively easy to do because of the structural form of the department. There's all some similarity in which you can collaborate on. But you're also talking about partners, you're talking about kids, you're talking about what's the term of this if someone wants to pull out. I mean, I think that's a brief answer as opposed to just purely thinking in terms of classroom. What can we do in the classroom? Think about, how can we create a culture of everyday practice that's collective in nature, and what does that do in terms of, I mean, I think interesting things start happening to the way you relate to yourself and relate to others just by inaugurating different form of practice.
I think I would add to that, or maybe reframe slightly, and to suggest that in terms of pedagogy, one can conceive of the university campus as a whole space of pedagogy, right? So how workers are treated by administration. A strike is pedagogical. It's a sort of civics lesson, right, if you will. And showing up on a picket line is clearly pedagogical. In terms of transforming university spaces, Occupy, clearly. Starting in certain, let's say since 2008, we had, leading up to Occupy Wall Street itself, a whole wave of occupations at the New School in California, and subsequent to that at Cooper Union, where you had this extraordinary scene where students, undergraduates, were occupying the president's office to protest tuition, or the introduction of tuition for the first time at Cooper Union. And the president of the university showed up in his office, and the occupiers then had a live stream and were kind of in a back and forth. So that's a moment, like at least an hour, where the process of administrative consultation, getting input, soliciting input, gets radically transformed into this is an active back and forth in a dynamic space where that has been reappropriated by the students who attend the school. I think beyond that, in terms of specific tactics, I think there's the whole ensemble of labor organizing, campus labor coalitions, getting your campus unions all aligned with bargaining at the same time, so you can go out and force on a picket line or go on strike at the same time. I was at the Coalition of Contingent Academic Labor Conference this past August, and Stanley Aronowitz, the sociologist, made a very strong plea for wildcat strikes. So I think that's definitely on the table. And just briefly, in terms of funding, I would say that the social wealth is there. It's just in the wrong bank accounts, or in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland and so forth. In fact, corporations in the United States have conservatively $2 trillion in liquid assets, in cash, that they're not investing. Corporations these days mostly just buy their own stock and further enrich their shareholders. They don't tend to, these days, invest in new production. So that's there. The top Forbes 400, top 400 richest people in the United States, worth $2 trillion. So I think it's really a matter of allocation. And there, in the history of the United States, there have been expropriative measures, whether you want to look at the marginal income tax rates after World War II. Of course, that harkens back to the nostalgic, yesteryear. I don't know if everyone agrees, but I think, building working class power through class struggle would, in one strategy, entail making a claim on the state. And that includes not electing Democrats, maybe electing socialists like Kshama Sawant in Seattle, or Howie Hawkins. I mean, that's a long-term debate. But yeah, and just to end, another expropriation of wealth, 1863, Emancipation Proclamation, kind of an undersung expropriation of property, if you think about it from one angle.
I just want to say something really brief, just because Andrew was speaking to some things that are close to me, because I'm in New York City and I actually live 3 blocks from Cooper Union and participated in that organizing campaign, which was really great. The other thing there that you mentioned was Stanley Aronowitz, right? And I just wanted to speak just a bit about that, right? Because one of the claims we make here, and I think I really want to emphasize this, right, so it doesn't get lost, isn't that we really truly believe is that full-time faculty, tenured faculty, established faculty actually have to be on the front lines, right? Stanley Aronowitz, though, is a complicated figure in this, right? Because I'm at the City University of New York. So Stanley Aronowitz, right, at the COCAL conference, which was hosted by CUNY over the summer, and I have great respect for Stanley, of course, and he's participating in the Graduate Center chapter of our union, you know, makes the claim, right, that we should be going on wildcat strikes, right? So fine, we should be doing that, right? But the union, the Professional Staff Congress, right, which has 20,000 members, dominated by a 14-year in power incumbent caucus, right, has completely bungled, right, our contract campaign, and we're going into a 5th year of an expired contract, right? And the strategy, because they're a local of AFT, right, which is totally exact with the Democratic Party, right? The strategy was, let's put all of our resources of the union into electing de Blasio, so that de Blasio will immediately fix the contract impasse, right? Of course, at CUNY, it's super complex because our budget's controlled by both the City of New York and the State of New York, right? So I was really pleased to see the Cuomo dig in here, right? Because rumor has it, actually, that because Cuomo is so anti-education, we have yet to receive an economic offer for our contract. And rumor has it that it's actually sitting on Cuomo's desk, and he's just refusing to move on it just because he's actually this creativist of a person. I'm really happy to be on record saying that. But the complicated thing about a figure like Stanley Aronowitz, right, is because he will make these statements to the press, but at the contract that we bargained several years ago, which was a thoroughly bad contract by every measure, right, and yet again left out adjuncts from any kind of movement towards parity, left out graduate students, right? The union trotted him in to the delegate assembly meetings and to sell the bad contract. And there were graduate students in the meeting saying to him, Stanley, you would tell us the exact opposite in our classrooms, right? And so this is part of the complexity of the situation, right? Is the way that tenured faculty both need to be out there, but can also be very easily co-opted by all sorts of forces.
Former member of the UAW here, so.
So if I could just add one thing. So I'm at a university in a right-to-work state. We don't have a union. The idea that we would get a union, it's more likely that we will go to Mars tomorrow than that we would get a union in the next 10 years. It's a very conservative campus. And actually there's been recently, there was a Rolling Stone, I'm at the University of Virginia, there was just a Rolling Stone piece about a very brutal gang rape by 7 men of a woman at a fraternity house. And actually it turns out there had been several gang rapes in a cluster at that fraternity house. And students, to my delight and incredible surprise, have started organizing around this. And so one of the things I want to add to occupation as a strategy is the idea of disruption. So if there's any UVA frat boys watching the live stream, you should be on warning, because there are students and faculty who are organizing to go to frat parties today and tomorrow and to disrupt those frat parties and to make noise. And the goal of it is just to assert the incredible violence of that space that goes unsaid, and just to make people feel as though they can walk wherever they want on their university campus, and that they can make people feel uncomfortable, and that they can use their bodies in ways that empower them, and where they get to say, like, I'm not just a victim in waiting, which is something that I think often happens. So one thing I think in terms of strategy is to think about, like, I mean, sometimes it's not feasible in your situation to have these like long-term things like occupations, or you don't have a union, and so you don't have a bargaining unit. And so I think thinking about strategic ways that you can get individuals to realize their power, their collective power, but also to make other people uncomfortable, even briefly, is really important. Like I have disrupted so many meetings that like nothing, I mean, all it means is we delayed them for like a couple hours, they're annoyed, but they, I mean, like that everyone feels empowered later, but also people are like aware of the fact that like when you talk about raising tuition, you're talking about like this incredible leverage that you hold over someone's lives. And just like having that hanging in the room can be incredibly important. And then the only other thing I would say in terms of this question of electing, you know, like let's elect Democrats, and the idea, I mean, I actually do think that like capital is going to run out pretty soon, even if there is a lot of, I mean, that like specie is all speculative anyway, so like it doesn't matter how much someone is worth, in my opinion. But so, I mean, I would just say that people are really impatient now, and so even to say like elect a Democrat in the next 2-year cycle, I know a lot of people who I think see themselves as like more mainstream leftists who think like that's, I don't want to wait that long. And so I have found, I mean, I should say everything I do has been a failure, and that my dissertation is about failure, so I'm just like embedded in failure. But I do think that people are willing to do other things, that to say like, we're not going to be able to elect a governor who's going to roll back tuition raises at this university. It's just like not going to happen. We're not going to get what we call a board of visitors, a board of trustees who are on board with that. And so we need to do something else, because like we're going to have another, you know, 5% tuition raise this year. There's probably going to be another 5% tuition raise again next year. We've cut the only like major financial aid program that we had at UVA. And so I think that people, when they see that, are more willing to say like, it's not about the election cycle, we have to do something else. And while maybe there's a kind of dishonesty in not calling that a communizing project, I found that it's something that like people are very willing to get on board with.
Chase, and then, yeah, can we get both of your questions and then pass them to the panel?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can't remember who exactly, but somewhere between Andrew and Kareem, you mentioned how kind of like the leftover vestiges of trade unionism in the contemporary university reinforces kind of like false divisions between laborers that keep us from organizing the way that we need to. And kind of bouncing off Annie's last question and some of the things that Sean was saying about the way that AFT behaved with Cuomo. What do you think that the major national and international teaching or teachers unions or other unions that represent other forms of labor on the contemporary at the contemporary university, do you think that they have a place in and will play a role in this communization of the university? I mean, I've been working with this graduate union for 2 years. We pay per caps to AFT. Is this an activity that you guys would encourage? Do you think that they are? I mean, no, seriously, I want to know, because I mean, what do you think of the major national and international teachers unions? Do you think that their answer to the problems is sufficient? Do you think they have a role in communizing the university?
Dave, do you want to go?
Yes. Sure, I can add mine. Yeah, pleasure to hear you. I'll speak again. I want to take up the issue of like rethinking academic space. And I think my observation is that I think there's a lot of what you're saying that's extremely pertinent to UW-Milwaukee right now. On the same side of this, we're in a room that could fit 150 people. We have 28 people. When you take away the panel, we have 21 people. The conflict with the English grad students, would account for part of that, but I think also a lot of what say, is very pertinent for people who are, in terms of beyond sort of English department. And I don't know, just thinking through that, like looking at the sort of run through of how this sort of conference, this panel presentation is worded. I mean, competing utopias in class composition. It seems that it replicates a lot of the elements of academese and this sort of professionalized way, even while it's sort of critiquing that. So in that sense, it's like less surprising that this room isn't packed. And I think that maybe sort of also thinking sort of what we do and can do is like would be productive. And there's another component of that, just noting that like, right now I'm in terms of seats as part of lecture halls facing up on sort of the panel. So again, it's sort of replicating that on the most basic level. And I wonder whether, in terms of just thinking about even like in the context of UW-Milwaukee, we could be having the same conversation. Student union with rooms where like chairs can be picked up and moved and made into a circle. Even relatively basic stuff like that. So I guess the question would be whether that sort of see elements like we can make some of our ideas, critiques that are, I think, would be more popular and pertinent, and bring them to a wider audience by removing some of the, things in the elements of the university that I think we sometimes unconsciously replicate.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think this is what part of the Gordon Dining Hall was trying to illustrate, is that restructuring the communizing university requires, it doesn't, like when we're talking about the structure of the university, it's also quite literal. The structure of the university, the way seats are placed, it's like you try and accommodate. And so one of the arguments, I suppose, is the scale, right? It's like, well, you fit more people into a room by lining them up this way, blah, blah, blah. But it's not true. Concentric circle, you can think of all kinds of ways of organizing space. But so this is what I mean, like the way space is organized in the university very much dictates social relations. And so, yeah, I think part of it is, how should I say, the conventional form of this is what you're pointing at. But I want to also emphasize how we're talking about the spatial organization and the temporal organization of labor time and labor movement that also results in this configuration of having 20 people in the room, like talking about the people who are at the getting teaching instruction. As for the teachers union, I honestly can't, I don't have an answer.
I think there's going to be some hot opinions on that, so I'm curious to hear.
I mean, to me, it's all tactical and situational, and so it's hard to judge when one thing becomes effective and one thing doesn't. And since I don't know the history very well, I can't really.
I mean, I would say in terms of AFT, I mean, I'm a member of AFT as well. I think I think John Fleissner isn't here, I guess.
Well, that's why I asked that question, is because he's absent.
Yeah, I would say.
I feel like I can speak freely.
Although this is technically being video recorded, so he could go back and.
But I think like the fact that they're still caught in this kind of problem of like, oh, we need to get away from like service unionism and figure out some other way, but they don't really know what that means. Like, let's not treat unionism like this like you go like buy a health insurance program or something like that, and like you just get the stuff back for it. And they're trying, like, I mean, as of however many years ago, we're really trying to figure out some way to speak about unionism otherwise, but haven't found a particularly effective way. I think speaks to a strong outdatedness and a lack of being able to build meaningful relationships with the kind of things that Annie was talking about, which is like occupation movements, with Occupy, with actually cultivating culture for radical direct action would completely change the face of an organization like that. And I think, I mean, also one of the things that, so like, as a TA member at UW-Madison, I think like the reason that we continue to use the AFT is because they have a massive national network. They have an infrastructure and they have communication networks. This is precisely the point that's made that by, theorists of communizing knowledge systems and social networks, that we need to be building those and producing those on our own in such a way that they're from the ground up rather than from the top down. So also that we're not throwing a ton of money away. Sorry, like throwing a lot of money away for something that we actually don't get anything for, but we're doing ourselves a disservice by outsourcing that work when it's actually quite pragmatically feasible for us to build the very thing that they give us, which is infrastructure and communication networks. But so yeah, I mean, I think precisely the point of trying to think about the ways in which labor has been totally restructured over the past, in a post-Fordist era, has to do with trying to look for the contradictions that can be turned into something else. And so when you have international student workers working in dining service alongside of low-wage workers and working in the community, I mean, that's an incredibly powerful, like those should be the exemplary sites that we're thinking about for unionism, not faculty versus graduate students versus everyone else. And I think to a large extent, for historical reasons, they have to use large people doing that.
And also, it's like one of the problems has also been the unemployed. Like, it's like you can always do training to be employed, but it's like how do you organize the unemployed? Well, it's like we're privileged that we're going to be unemployed in some sense, just because I mean, it's a joke, but you get the idea. It's like in few social spaces you get a structured meeting of something like that, like the future unemployed. You have the custodial workers, you have administrative staff, you have professional. It's like this is a moment in which the organizational space is right to cross the traditional trading
This is one of the most amazing things about that haven't really heard anyone talk about the capital occupation in 2011, was that the vast majority of people who actually ended up there overnight and for long periods of time were homeless people in Madison. They weren't workers. There was a group of grad students, but chronically underemployed and homeless people. This was never the story that came out of the occupation. This is precisely the problem with the trained unionism model. Like, we need to figure out a way, like Kuhn said, to corral that power dynamic between the underemployed, the unemployed, and the employed. That story never came out of the capital occupation.
So what I'll just mention, there's this guy, David Stein. He's a fellow at CUNY, actually. He's a postdoctoral fellow. He's doing really interesting research about organizing former inmates. Because, you know, inmates, this is a great point that he made in a presentation at the American Studies Association conference a few weeks ago, where, you know, part of the ways that wages are kept low is because former inmates have to work in order to maintain their parole conditions, and then that means that they can't say no to a job, or they can't, you know, like threaten to walk off, because then they might go back to prison. And so it has these ripple effects where not only are they being sort of continued exploiting by this system, but all wages are being kept low, because then if you enter a site where there are a lot of former inmates there, you're not going to find a lot of support for trying to say, like, we deserve better, we can do better. But he has been really thinking about this question of unemployment, the question of former inmates, and the question of trade unionism, and looking back to the Popular Front in the 1930s and the ways that they organized what then was seen as a non-natural organizing bloc in terms of getting these different guilds to work together. And so he's posited this distinction between the employing class and the employed and unemployed or underemployed class. And he has suggested that everyone who falls into the employed, unemployed, or underemployed class could be constructed as a natural organizing bloc. It's just a matter of rethinking models of unionism and becoming a little bit more radical in that sense. So I mean, I think that this kind of work is really exciting and actually something that could have a lot of benefits for the way that we're thinking about things if we let go, as Nora was saying, about the idea that this professional, non-professional divide, if those things go away, but also the employed, underemployed, unemployed divide starts to go away, especially given how precarious so much work is now. Like, we're all just waiting to be unemployed, it feels like at some moments. And so I think that that is something that has a lot of good, a lot of benefits. And I just want to speak to Jacob's point. I think, you know, yeah, we are really thinking about professionalization, and, you know, the question I think that came up with us is how to remain legible while also doing what we wanted to do. And Andrew at one point had actually suggested that, like, we could break the presentation apart into its different pieces and meet with groups of people and have a kind of discussion and then have a report out and have that be the whole presentation. And so for a variety of reasons, we thought, like, maybe that's not going to be as effective as other sorts of means. But Nora's been talking to a lot of indigenous groups in Vancouver, so we're going to go on a walking tour. We've been encouraging participants of the subconference to really be thinking outside of these presentation boxes as a way to start to say, how can we rethink the way that we just, you know, like, share information and interact with information in ways that puts the geographic site really at its core. So I mean, I don't have a good answer for you. I think that this is something that we need to keep thinking about, and that we're, you know, like, we'd love to hear more ideas about, or I'd love to hear more ideas about.
And if I could just say one brief thing, and then I know there's other questions. You know, even while we were sitting here, we were thinking about different ways of how we could have done this, right? The other thing I want to put out there, again, like, we actually take very seriously the fact that 60-some graduate assistants and adjuncts teaching composition cannot be here. One of the things that we were thinking about doing last night was actually saying to you all, we're going to, I mean, no, I know it sounds like a joke. We were very seriously interested in basically crashing that event, right? Which would have been very rude, and would have been read as uncivil and all these things, which is fine. I get called this all the time, right? But there's actually something deeply problematic about this conflict, right? And I don't want to personalize it, right? But people who are leading this thing, right, we're at the event last night, right? And part of what's happened, right, is that the ways that, you know, we talked a little bit about labor trading in the presentation, right? But one of the things we know about the way that administrative governmentality is expanding in college campuses, right, is that it's always incorporating disciplining more subjects, right? So there's a graduate student, right, who's actually the supervisor of the graduate assistant teachers, right? And many of them prevailed upon this person, right, to change the time, right? And that didn't happen. And I'm not calling out anybody, I'm just saying, think about that problematic, right? And so we could have done that. And I'm all for destabilizing, you know, spaces and presentations. God knows I've done enough of them. I try to destabilize, you know, I try to destabilize a space and with every presentation I do, but we also made precisely, I think, a call about legibility and also about hospitality and, I mean, all these sort of complicating factors, right? And also we wanted to be, we're really thankful to the Center for 21st Century Studies, right? And I think we also wanted to make sure that we were, you know, I think in obeyance, not obeyance, but I was thinking, not obeyance, but right, that we were being consistent with the kind of hospitality that has been shown to us, right? And I don't mean hospitality in a corporatized sense, but I mean in a loving way, do you know what I mean? And I think there's an ethic of care and self-care that we were also thinking about as well.
So we've been, I've really been annoyed at these training sessions at 3:30 on Fridays since I've been here. Because, not because, you know, it's for us to have graduate students here, but it's for them. I mean, you know, we bring in really interesting speakers and we create these events, and I can't tell you how many times, you know, I've been told this, and I have, you know, tried to suggest maybe they could find some other times to do this to no avail, but I wish it, I mean, this event in particular, this is the first I actually heard about it. I would have been happy if we had just gone down and disrupted that would have been fantastic. So, wish you guys had brought it up earlier.
It's ending at 5. It's 5, so.
Well, there are the symbolic window of
Their events that I don't know if we have time to keep going, right? There's more questions.
I just wanted, I wanted to say something super brief about the labor movement. Just in the last couple of years, we've seen kind of a redefinition of what counts as a labor union. And, you know, 100 or so years ago, the industrial workers of the world innovated in the domain of industrial unionism across employment sectors. Today we have non-majority or so-called minority unions in fast food and retail and food service and that kind of thing, supported by national unions, SEIU, United Food and Commercial Workers. But, you know, there's an acknowledgement from top labor leaders, and I just saw Richard Trumka and a few others speak last week at University of Chicago, that workers acting together collectively is a union. And I think Nora is absolutely right that that workers workers acting collectively can get resources from international unions, right? But what really matters is what you do on the ground. Along with, I would say, expanding the reach of, you know, what counts as labor organizing. So organizing in where workers live, doing tenant organizing, and standing in solidarity with social movements that haven't been traditionally associated with labor. So I think really pulling on all the resources of, you know, what can count as class struggle, and certainly not following the orders of, you know, whatever international rep who happens to be, you know, on the scene, however uncomfortable that might be.
So maybe we should recompose our academic space and go upstairs. We've got hospitality in the form of food and drink, and we can then talk more one-on-one, one-on-two, rather than this kind of pattern. So thank you.